For our next task, we actually have to manage this Nano server instance that we've created. And that process starts here, at least with the way that we've deployed it here so far, by actually getting an IP address here on this machine. Now, you should be aware that Microsoft really intends every Nano server to be deployed as a DHCP client. The whole point here of Nano servers, because you can build them up and tear them down very quickly, the whole point here is that you should have a similarly easy to configure IP addressing scheme for these machines. But here in this environment, because we don't have DHCP services turned on here just yet, let's go through the slightly more difficult, but also slightly more manual way of assigning a hard IP here to this machine. Again, in the production world, you're usually going to use DHCP for these services. Let me come here into my Nano server and then punch in my username and password, which will be that administrator username and password that I punched in when I first created this VHDX file. Let me punch in the password here. The domain's going to be the local domain, at least at this point. And you can see here that the recovery console provides only a very limited set, kind of a text menu here for the different kinds of items that we can configure. They are limited exclusively to networking, your inbound and outbound firewall rules, and then WinRM down here at the bottom. Let's first configure networking on this machine. This will be the networking on the single network adapter. That's that Ethernet adapter you can see right there. And for it, what we need to do, if I scroll down here, is set up the IPv4 address to one that actually can be addressed here in this environment. Let me scroll down here to the bottom and show you that Microsoft really doesn't want you to use hard-coded IP addresses here. In part because in order to actually change the settings, if I punch F1 here, the only thing you can do is disable DHCP here by hitting F4 and then punching in the IP address, the subnet mask, and then the default gateway. You'll notice that even DNS configurations are not available here in the recovery console. The only way to set up who your DNS server will be is to have the DHCP server deliver it, or then to go back into that machine and then change that configuration there with remote Windows PowerShell. So again, DHCP is definitely kind of the way that Microsoft wants us to manage these machines. Let me punch in here an IP address for this computer that runs on my network, which is 3net. Let's do 112. And then also a subnet mask here, so a 24-bit subnet mask, and then my gateway address, which is 3.2. So your addressing may be different here, but this is what will work to connect it up with the other machines here in my environment. I will choose Enter then to save this information. So that now becomes the IP address here on this machine. That's all that we can do here in terms of setting up the IP address for this computer. One of the other configurations we need to do before we then remotely address this machine is to open up the necessary firewall ports as well. And in fact, let me hit the escape key to go back to that original menu, and let's make some modifications here just to the inbound firewall rules to allow, for example, the ping command to work against that IP address, and also so that our remote PowerShell commands, so those running on top of our Windows 10 machine, can then make the necessary changes here on the machine that we're working with. You'll see here that with these firewall rules, we have a fairly long list of the rules that exist here. There's file and printer sharing rules and remote event log management tool rules and so on and so forth. But the two at minimum that are required in order to continue to manage this machine will be the first one right here, file and printer sharing SMB in right here, and then also echo request ICMP4 in. These will allow here in the second example, the ping command to work. I think actually in that last module I may have said IGMP, but I meant ICMP. But ICMP is what allows ping to work here against this machine, and SMB is what allows all the other commandlets to work. So let's hit the Enter key here to select this particular firewall rule, and then choose right down here the F4 key to enable the firewall rule. You'll see it's set here, enabled equals to yes. I'll choose the escape key to go back and then do the same thing for SMB in. Let's now change this to enable, and now we have the two firewall ports now open, or the two rules now open, so that we can manage this machine. I can exit out of this machine and come back to the console here, and then if I bring up, let's say here, a remote command prompt, let's actually just double check to make sure that indeed we can access this machine via ping. Here under More and Run as Administrator, let me try ping 192.168.3.112. And indeed, we do have a reply now from this machine. I obviously won't be able yet to ping its host name because we haven't got this machine attached up to DNS services just yet. So let's minimize this and continue our steps in managing this Nano server instance. We now need to be able to use PowerShell to apply remote commands onto this machine to do things like configuring up, for example, the DNS services. In order to do that, I have a couple of things I need to do first. Let me bring up here our Windows PowerShell command prompt again. And one of the very first things we need to do is to open up sort of the trust model here, because we don't yet have a full DNS name for this machine. PowerShell itself does not like for you to remotely apply commands to machines where you don't even have host names just yet. And so we kind of have to hack things here just a bit in order to enable this machine as a trusted host on which we can run commands. We accomplish that with the command here, set item wsman against localhost. This is, again, on to our Windows 10 machine. In the trusted hosts location here, let us now open up the abilities to manage this remote host 3.112. So this should, if I hit Y here, then allow us to manage that remote machine. Next up is for us to store our credentials there in a variable so that we can then use them later. Let's create that variable getCredential and then punch in the credentials for the administrator account on that remote computer. That will allow me to reuse this $cred variable later on. With it then created, we can now enter in the PS session. So essentially enter into that remote computer so that we can then add in or enter in all those commands for configuring our Nano server instance. Let's do that here with computer name 192.168.3.112 and the credential here being the $cred credential we created a second ago. This will now attach us to that remote machine so that we can continue now our configuration on that computer. So let's now, on this remote machine 3.112, start this process by checking out all the DNS configurations that we need to set up and then pointing this towards the DNS server here for our environment. Let's take a look here. DNS client server address right here should tell us that, well, for our Ethernet address right here, we are simply using the default Ethernet addresses here, these IPv6 addresses, and nothing here for IPv4. So let's enter in a separate command here, which I'll copy and paste from over here, which will configure up a connection to 192.168.3.10, my domain controller and DNS server, as the primary DNS server for this machine. Let me just double check things here. Indeed, we now have this set up to 3.10, and now we can exit back to the local desktop and know that now on that Nano server, we can address really everything else on the internet and my intranet here. Now, since this machine has already been named as part of the creation, the original creation of that VHDX file, our next step here is just simply to join this machine to the domain, which is a process that requires the offline domain join function that's been around in Windows now for, I think, a couple of versions. You may have never have used offline domain join in the past, but this process here with Nano server is really the only way in which to get those Nano server instances themselves actually attached up to an Active Directory domain. There are a couple of commands that we need to use here that I'll also copy and paste here from my little cheat sheet over here on the right. These commands are not PowerShell commands. They are rather legacy commands that were used with the legacy version of the command prompt here that all relate to the djoin command. The first of these commands provisions out a blob, a set of code that we can then use and transfer over to the machine awaiting that domain join so that it has all the information it requires to complete the domain join. But we need to first execute this first command on a machine that is already domain joined. Notice here that I'm running it on my Windows 10 instance here that already is a member of my Active Directory domain. And so I'm provisioning out that necessary information here against the company.pri domain for the machine where I will copy this file, nanoserver1. I'll save the file then to nanoserver1.txt in that location there in C nanoserver. This will create a file that I then need to transfer to my Nano server and then execute the subsequent command to have it complete this process. This will go through creating the necessary accounts there in Active Directory and all the preparatory steps that are needed so the second half of this process can complete successfully. You can see here that we've now created this file here, nanoserver1.txt, and if I take a look here, we should be able to see the file right around here somewhere, right here. And there's really nothing to see here. It's just a very long series of letters and numbers that will then be consumed by that Nano server when we run the second command. Let us come back here and now create a connection to that Nano server so we can copy this file over. To accomplish that, I can connect to this Nano server just like I would any machine. Let's come down here to 192.168.3.112/$. And if you have all the appropriate administrator passwords there entered in, I actually went through that already there in the background, you can see a copy of the C drive here on our Nano server. Let us now copy this file that we just created over here to the C drive on that remote machine. That file is right here, nanoserver1.txt. And if I make the copy here and copy it there to the root of C, our last step here in the process is to go about actually completing the second command there so that we can then have this machine complete its join to our Active Directory domain. Let me come back over here and enter PS session once again. So we will go to computer name 192.168.3.112 with the credentials being $cred. Then once they're on that remote machine, let me then copy and paste the final domain join command or djoin command so we can take a look at what we actually need to enter in here. That command here is djoin, request offline domain join, with loading the file here, which is our Nano Server 1 file that we just copied, the Windows path being C Windows, and then local OS, which you can see right here, local OS being the last parameter here. Let me punch that to go about then provisioning this final step to go about adding in this Nano server here into my Active Directory domain. This completes the process of getting this machine now on the domain and making it available for the later installation of, for example, roles and features here onto this Nano server. I can complete this process here by running restart computer to go about actually restarting the machine and preparing it for some later configuration.